Hey guys, for today's lecture, we're going to talk about federalism. Before I get heavily into lecture, there's a couple of terms, well, there's a few, not a couple. There's a few terms that I want to make sure you understand. The first term, sovereignty. Sovereignty is simply the ability to carry out actions or policies within a territory independently from external actors or internal rivals. So, sovereignty is the ability of a government to set up, to enact its own policies within its territory without these policies, without these procedures being dictated to it by somebody else. So sovereignty is you are the absolute ruling authority within your boundary, within your territory. Nobody else can tell you what to do. Unitary government or unitary system. This is a governing system that gives most power to the federal or to the national government. This means that the states or the regional governments underneath the federal or national government would have little power. This unitary government is what we are participating in when we were the colonies. The crown had all the power. The colonies had very little. Confederation. Please remember, a confederation is a system with a weak national government, but it has strong state or regional governments. Finally, and what we ended up with today, federalism. Federalism is where a constitution divides powers and functions between the central, the national, the federal government, and the regional or the state governments. So in federalism, we have two types of government. Federalism comes from the Constitution. The Constitution limited national government by creating a second layer of government, this state government power. The Constitution, the Bill of Rights, recognizes two sovereign powers by granting a few expressed powers to the national government and reserving all other powers to the state. So it gives all powers, grants few powers to feds, everything else belongs to the state. So the powers of national government. How many expressed powers did I say Congress had? Are these not expressed, these enumerated? Congress has 17 enumerated powers. Some of these include the power to collect taxes, the power to coin money, to declare war, to regulate commerce. Where are all these powers going to be found? Article 1. The Necessary and Proper Clause, also known as the Elastic Clause, is found in Article 1, Section 8. This provides an important source of power for the national government, for Congress. It gives Congress implied powers. These are powers which are not specifically expressed, but are implied through the expansive interpretation of something called delegated powers. So the Elastic Clause allows Congress to expand its powers to go beyond that which is specifically written, which is specifically stated in the U.S. Constitution. What you need to know about the elastic clause right now is historically, the Supreme Court has let the elastic clause significantly expand the powers of Congress. Okay. Article 6 affirms national power in the Supremacy Clause. We talked about this. Supremacy Clause says that any national law, any law created by the federal government, any treaty entered into by the federal government, any judicial decision by this federal government supersedes that of the states. So national powers, U.S. Constitution, Article 1, going to be Congress. There are 17 expressed or enumerated powers. Go with enumerated. Article 1, Section 8, the elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause. Then Article 6, the supremacy clause. The powers of state government. Where do we find the powers of state government? We say we have this idea of federalism. The Constitution creates two levels of government. Well, first off, why would this idea of federalism, why would this limit the power of federal? It limits the power of federal because it says the states have certain powers. So it tells us that there are certain things that the state can do that the federal can't. Well, that's in a nutshell explanation. Does it really? Let's look at the powers of state government. If we want to find the powers of state government, do we find it in the Constitution? The actual Constitution itself. Remember, Article 1 created the legislative branch, Article 2, the executive branch, Article 3, the judiciary, Article 4, Article 6, national unity, national power. Article 5, that's actually the amendments. I didn't tell you that. Then Article 7 is ratification. Guys, we just ran out of articles in the Constitution. Did you hear me mention state powers? No. So what's the next thing? The Bill of Rights. Okay, let's start looking through our Bill of Rights. First Amendment, freedom, press, assembly, speech. Nothing about states. Second, right to bear arms. Nothing about states. Third, Quartering Act says we do not have to quarter troops in our homes for the government. That's not state related. Fourth, search and seizure. Fifth, self-incrimination. Sixth, right to counsel, right to a trial by jury. Seventh, we have the right to sue. 8, cruel and unusual punishment. 9 is said to be the right to privacy. Guys, I still haven't mentioned state powers, state government. Finally, in the 10th Amendment, the last amendment in the Bill of Rights, we find mention of state government. The 10th Amendment to the Constitution is also called the Reserved Powers Amendment. It states that powers not delegated to the national government nor prohibited to the states are, and this is where we get this Reserved Powers Amendment title, powers not delegated to the national government nor prohibited to the state are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So any power that is not specifically given to the federal government, any power that is not specifically prohibited to the states is reserved for the states or for the people. This was an amazing concept back in the 1780s, 1790s. How come? Even back then, they realized that not all powers had been discovered. Have we discovered all powers today? No, we still make new discoveries. There's new powers, due to whatever reason. We're discovering new powers, and thanks to the 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, these powers are reserved for the people. So this is theory. Reality, what we say, what we see, what we can say. States retain the power of coercion. This can also be referred to as the police power. This is the state's power to regulate the health, safety, and morals of its citizens. What do I mean by morals? I'm just talking about criminal laws. Through these powers of coercion, through these police powers, the state can develop and enforce criminal codes. They can administer health and safety rules. They can regulate family relationships, marriage, divorce, custody, etc. They can define property. Okay, so our government. The feds have their job. The states have their job. Two separate powers, two separate jobs. However, we do see powers that are shared between the national and the state government. They do share some powers. These are called concurrent powers, CONCURRENT. The shared powers are concurrent powers. So powers that are exercised or possessed both by the state and national government. The easiest concurrent power to illustrate is the power to tax. Also from the Constitution, state obligations to one another. Obligations among states seek to promote national unity. Some are spelled out in Article 4, Section 1. This is the full faith and credit clause. Any contract entered into in one state, any court decision entered or given in one state is legally binding in all other states. So the full faith and credit clause requires states to recognize and honor actions and public acts and decisions taken in other states. We have progressed past legal standings, legal contracts. This is also easy to illustrate. If you go on vacation, if you drive to Florida, if you drive to California, wherever you're going, you're driving using what allows you to drive? What allows you to operate a motor vehicle? Your Texas driver's license, issued to you by the state of Texas. Well, why is this still valid once we leave the state borders? Why is this Texas valid license recognized in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, if you're going to Florida? Reciprocity, RECIPROCITY. Texas, we issue our driver's license. The other 49 states recognize our license because Texas recognizes theirs. We are giving full faith and credit to the privilege that the individual states gave their citizens. So we see this with driver's license. If you're old enough, we see these with concealed carry, handgun licenses, this kind of thing. So that's full faith and credit. Article 1 Section 2. Excuse me. This is called, it has two names. It can be called the comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, C-O-M-I-T-Y, the comity clause, or the privileges and immunities clause. This clause says a state cannot discriminate against someone from another state or give special privileges to its residents. What I mean by this, California is notorious for violating this clause. Within the last couple of years, the court actually told them that they were violating this clause and cut it out. Is if people in California want to hire, if companies in California want to hire, can they only hire people from California? Can they automatically dismiss? Can they automatically decide they're not going to hire people from outside the state of California? No, they can't. That's a violation of the comity clause. So, Article 4, Section 1, full faith and credit clause. Article 2, the comity clause, or the privileges and immunities clause. Last one, local government and the Constitution. Where do we find local government in the Constitution? There's 3 levels of government, federal, state, and local. Where do we find local government in the Constitution? We don't. Remember, federalism, the Constitution, only creates federal government. It only creates state government. Local government is left up to the states. We find that created in state constitutions. The definition of federalism has changed radically over time. Federalism, under the traditional system, gave most powers to the states. The Constitution creates 2 layers of government, national and state. These layers created a traditional system of government, or something called dual federalism. This dual federalism system. This traditional system, this dual federalism, was the system of government that prevailed in the United States from 1789 to 1937. During this period, under traditional system, under dual federalism, most fundamental powers were shared between the federal and state government. What I mean by this, I say they're shared. What I mean is they were shared in the extent that, yes, they each had their own job to do. During this period, the national government narrowly specialized in the functions it performed. From 1789 to 1937, the federal government basically had 2 jobs. They assisted the state with commerce, so they existed to promote commerce and economic growth, and they existed to protect property, provide protection for the people. So their 2 jobs: promote commerce, protect property. Meanwhile, from 1789 to 1937, the states are doing most of the governing. They're doing most of the work. They're doing the heavy lifting of government by regulating private property, by overseeing practices such as medicine, law. They are overseeing government by developing and enforcing family and criminal laws. So each level had its own job to do. This arrangement allows the country to thrive because many political issues, such as slavery, were so divisive that had the national government sought to regulate them, the country might have collapsed. Over history, the The national government scope has expanded to local affairs. However, national power expansion has not altered the basic American framework because states have continued to be central to the federal system. The federal framework provides for national stability when local issues such as slavery were the most divisive. Okay, so we start off with this traditional system, this dual federalism system. Feds have their job, protect property, promote economy. States do almost everything else. Well, what we see is that the courts pave the way for the end of the traditional system. The role of the national government has slowly expanded over history. The Supreme Court laid the groundwork for national government expansion by broadly construing the powers granted by the Necessary and Proper Clause, McCulloch versus Maryland. That's the court case, McCulloch versus Maryland, and the Commerce Clause, Gibson versus Odkins. I'm going to provide a link or some writings on these two cases. Please read these, and actually a third case. While Congress did not immediately use its powers that the Supreme Court offered, the Supreme Court let Congress overstepped its authority. They overstepped its enumerated powers, and the Supreme Court said, using the Necessary and Proper Clause, it's okay. Read about these cases, and you'll understand. While Congress did not immediately use the powers the Supreme Court offered, it did eventually use its authority to promote economic development. However, in the late 1800s, when Congress tried to use the same power to regulate, so to limit as opposed to simply promote the economy, the Supreme Court found that national interference in the workplace was unconstitutional, for it violated individual states' police powers. What am I looking for here? Okay. FDR's New Deal remade the government. Changes came about as a result of the Great Depression of the 1930s. Demand for national intervention in the economic crisis led to Roosevelt's New Deal. One cornerstone of the New Deal was a series of federally funded stimulus programs that through which the federal government made grants to the states to undertake projects to put people to work. So we see the federal government start to expand their idea of what the federal government should be responsible for, what their job is. So changing courts' interpretation of federalism helped Roosevelt's New Deal. In 1937, we leave the traditional system, this dual federalism system, behind. Now we're going to go to something called cooperative federalism. Let me try and give a visual to help explain the difference between dual federalism and cooperative federalism. Well, traditional system, traditional federalism, and this cooperative federalism. Traditional federalism, also known as dual layer or dual federalism. If I have any bakers in my class, What is a layer cake? A layer cake is a cake that consists of many layers. Each layer is its own distinct flavor. You might have vanilla on bottom. You might have chocolate as a second layer. You may have, I don't know, strawberry as a third layer, whatever. But each layer is its own distinct flavor. Dual layer federalism, traditional system, each government was a layer. They each had their own job. With cooperative federalism, starts in 1937. We can also call this marble cake federalism. Once again, my bakers, what is a marble cake? A marble cake, you throw 3 or 4, 2, 3, 4, however many packs of cake mix into a bowl. You combine them, you mix them up, you bake your cake. When you take a bite, what do you get? You get a swirl, you get a mixture. Under this cooperative federalism, this marble cake federalism, we start to see the federal government move into areas that had traditionally been reserved for the states. That under the traditional system, these powers had belonged to the states. Did the states appreciate this? No. Their complaint was this was a violation of the 10th Amendment. So now let's go ahead and talk about changing court interpretation. In 1937, the Supreme Court issues a series of decisions that lays the groundwork for a stronger federal government with the power to regulate commerce by limiting corporations' powers, and it gave the federal government more power to protect the welfare of the citizens. These rulings spelled the end of dual federalism. Yet, even today, proponents of states' powers continued to exist, specifically because certain groups saw state authority as the key to the advancement of their particular policy interest. For example, in the 1950s, the 10th Amendment was used to support racial segregation. From the 1990s to present day, conservatives have been united in an effort to limit excessive national power from restricting individual liberties. They believe such freedoms are better protected by devolution. Devolution is the policy of removing a program from a government level by passing it to a lower level of government, and I'll go into greater detail at the end. While proponents of states' rights have enjoyed a few court victories, the overall trend of this cooperative federalism, this marble cake federalism, has been to increase the scope of national power. We have to be really, really careful here because it is not spelled out which power belongs to which level of government. If we look at reserve powers, any powers not given to the feds are reserved for the states. Except that we know under Article 1, Section 8, the Necessary and Proper Clause, this allows Congress to expand their power beyond what is written in the Constitution. So, do we really know which power belongs to the federal government, which power belongs to the state? No, we do not have a clear idea. The Constitution does not draw this great big clear dividing line, this great big bright clear dividing line between state power and national power. State government, federal government, they argue all the time over power. Who has the final say? Who gets to make the final decision in which power belongs to which level? that's going to be the court system. Sometimes this argument isn't as clear as it seems. I mean, it seems like it'd be easy. Well, it's either state power or it's federal power. If we look at the 17th Amendment, the 17th Amendment deals with how we decide who our U.S. senators are. Today, every state elects its 2 U.S. senators. Before the 17th Amendment, the U.S. senators were selected by the state legislature. We amend the Constitution and we put the selection of U.S. senators we now elect U.S. senators with a popular vote. Some people say that this is a violation of the 10th Amendment. Is it? I don't know. I can tell you I don't know. There's 2 arguments here. One, this is a violation of 10th Amendment because the federal government stated that the state legislatures no longer got to select our U.S. senators. It became a popular vote for the people. So they did take that power away from the state legislature. But on the other hand, did the U.S. government take this power for themselves? No, they stripped it from the state legislature and gave it to the people of the state. Sometimes those questions of power and who has it and who's abusing it, very, very difficult to understand. But starting in 1937, we see the creation of this marble cake federalism, this cooperative federalism. Cooperative federalism pushes states to achieve national goals. So, the New Deal. This moves the United States from dual federalism to a system of cooperative federalism, of marble cake federalism, in which grants and aid, in which money have been strategically used to encourage state and local governments to pursue national goals, to pursue national wants. National standards have been used to advance these federal programs. This cooperative federalism have been used to advance national standards, national programs. How? I told you a second ago, money. Money is the great motivator. The federal government can use or withhold money in an effort to get the state governments to do what they want. Let's look at using money to get what they want. The state government, starting in 1937, under this cooperative federalism, this marble cake federalism, we saw this grant and aid as something called a categorical grant. Categorical grant is money from a higher level of government. This would be money from the federal government to the states, but with strings attached. With a categorical grant, there are 3 strings attached. The first string, we can only use the money for what the federal government says, so they get to dictate the use. Second string, we have to put in some type of matching funds. It might not be a dollar for dollar issue, but we, the state government, do have to put in some type of matching funds. The last, we have to be able to prove, we have to be able to show the federal government that we use the money the way it was intended. So, for an example, is the federal government might come in and tell Houston, we've done a study in the event of an emergency, whether it be a hurricane or something like that. We're looking at your evacuation routes. Most of your highways are pretty good with the exception of Interstate 10 westbound. Texas, we want you to expand Interstate 10 westbound from Katy out to Columbus to 4 lanes each way. We will give you $750 million if you kick in $50 million yourself. So let's start looking at this. Categorical grant. What are we using the money for? The federal government's telling us this money must be used to expand Interstate 10 west to 4 lanes. So they are dictating what the money is used for. Are we kicking in money? Yes, not dollar for dollar. They say we'll give $750 billion or $750 million if you kick in $50 million. So we are adding some of our own funds to this. Third prong, how do we show that the federal government that we use the money the way it was intended? Send them receipts, show them the picture of the traffic jam all the way out to Columbus, whatever. But that is a grant in aid, a categorical grant. We have to use the money the way the government dictates. There are those 3 strings. If we were lucky, we got offered the categorical grant. We got offered money. We see that, and even today, sometimes the federal government will hand down what are called unfunded mandates. Unfunded mandates, the federal government comes to the states and says, this is what you're going to do it. And the states are waiting for money, and the feds are looking at them, and the states finally realize they're not going to get any money. An example of this would be the American with Disabilities Act in the early 2000s. Government buildings were dictated that they were going to become handicapped accessible, and this was going to be at a cost, their own cost. They had to pay for it. Why do the states hate unfunded mandates? They hate unfunded mandates because A, they have to do this work. B, the money has to come from somewhere. So they have to pull money from other programs. They didn't have this planned. They have to pull money from other programs, basically kind of drop everything else and do what the federal government dictates. So this marble cake federalism, this cooperative federalism, starts in 1937. It goes until the late 1960s, early 1970s, when we enter into something called New Federalism. New Federalism, this is an idea that is put forth under President Nixon. President Ford and President Carter don't like this idea of New Federalism, so they don't do it. But President Reagan picks up President Nixon's idea of New Federalism and continues it on. So starts under President Ford, starts under President Nixon in the late 60s, early 70s, but it really gains steam under President Reagan in the 80s. New Federalism means more state control. The issue that people had with this categorical grant was the state government was being told that we had to use this money for this purpose. It was being dictated to us. It was a one-size-fits-all approach. New federalism, the presidents, the federal government are attempting to give more control, more freedom back to the states. So we see the introduction of this block grant. Block grant, the federal government might say, Texas, I am going to give you a block grant for transportation. Here are $3 billion. Use it for transportation-related projects. Why is this important? What is the distinguishing thing here? You know, I said that categorical grant, this was considered a one-size-fits-all. We are being told what to use it for. Under the block grant, we being the state, we get to prioritize. We get to say, you know what? Yeah, that I-10 stretch is bad, but there's other things that are worse. There's other things that we need to fix first. So with this block grant, as long as we are using this money in the category that it was designated for, we are good to go. So, you know, if we get $3 billion for transportation-related issues, well, we can fix 410 in San Antonio. You know, we can fix I-20 between Dallas and going to Shreveport. Yeah, let's go to Shreveport. So we get to prioritize. So this is better for us. This gives more power to the states. The states love block grants because this lets us prioritize. It gives us power. The federal government loves categorical grants because they retain the power. I'll say this is this is the use of money to get states to do what we want, that categorical grant. We can give states money to improve, to come closer to what we want. Do we always have to give money? Do we, meaning the federal government, always have to give money to convince the states to do what they want? And I'm not talking about an unfunded mandate. I'm not talking about where the federal government says, we are going to do this. Can the federal government tell the state, we would like you to do this, and it doesn't involve money? Yes, if it can involve the withholding of money. Back in the 1980s, the mid-80s, most states had a drinking age of 18. Texas had a drinking age of 18. The mid-80s, they raise it to 21. Why? Did Texas suddenly become concerned with the effect of alcohol on young people? No, not really. What the federal government said was, states, medical research shows that 18-year-olds, 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, they are abusing alcohol. The maturity level is not there. We would really, really appreciate it if you raised your drinking age to 21. Now, remember, states have the police powers, powers of coercion. So do they have to do this? No, they don't. But the federal government says, states, we understand you don't have to do this. If you do not raise your drinking age to 21, we're going to withhold federal transportation funds from your state. We're going to withhold money. What do you think the state said? We will change that law right away, federal government. Please keep those checks coming. Last thing, there is no simple answer to finding the right national-state balance. The allocation of policy making between state and federal governments can dramatically affect who benefits from policies. For example, redistributive programs, money taking from the rich, giving to the poor. these redistributive programs that are implemented by the national government are aimed at benefiting these poor. When these programs are devolved to the states, given to the states, states, on the other hand, they have an incentive to keep taxes and costs low. And thus, they are not necessarily going to want what the federal government wants with devolution. Devolution is the last thing I'm going to talk about. Devolution is basically passing the authority, the responsibility from one level of government to another. The example I use here, y'all remember a few years ago when the Zika virus hit? Zika virus, this was the virus passed by mosquitoes. If you're a male and it bit you, no big deal. If you were a woman and it bit you, no big deal. If you were a pregnant woman and it bit you, well, it could affect the fetus. So let's say, in this example of devolution, let's say that we have an outbreak of the Zika virus on the southern Texas border. Whose job is it to deal with this? The federal government, the state government, or the local government? I am going to say it is the responsibility of the federal government to do this, simply because this is a disease. Diseases don't recognize city lines. They don't recognize county lines. They don't recognize state boundaries. This is something that can spread from one state to another. So therefore, I say this is a federal government problem. They, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, have the responsibility to deal with this. Now, devolution, the federal government says, hey, Texas government, you have an outbreak of Zika. Now, we have the authority to deal with it, but since it's happening in your state, we are going to pass this responsibility down to you. It is going to pass from the federal government to the state government. The state government says, gee, thanks, appreciate that. But they then turn around and they look at the local governments. And they say, local governments, it is our job to deal with this. However, you already have boots on the ground. You have networks in place. Your doctors already know these people. So we're going to pass this responsibility down to you. Devolution, passing it down from one level of government to a lower level of government.